The distinction between prog and punk is usually seen as a strict line of division, right? Retrospectively. Of course, this frequently happens in art, right? Vanguards need to make a break vis-a-vis what's gone before them, right? But what I was thinking is that maybe the connection between prog and punk should be instead seen as more like a Moebius strip. What's a Moebius strip, you may ask, or not, depending on how much you know about topology. A Moebius strip is a band that if you follow it round, you end up in the same place you began in, but the other way up. Right. One thinks of the Escher painting of the ants. Now, in order to retrace this band, I propose today to discuss two 1970s albums that are located somewhere on the band between the starting point and the ending point, as it were. The first is Nadir's Big Chance by Peter Hammill, which has just come out on a big box set, of course. And the second one is Q, Are We Not Men? A, We Are Devo, by, you guessed it, Devo. Their debut album, in other words. Let's see what we find along the way, shall we? Now, the germ of Nadir's Big Chance perhaps begins in 1972 when the mega prog band, Van der Graaf Generator, are forced to retire for financial reasons. And Peter Hammill writes a sort of autobiographical, tragicomic farewell note, otherwise known as the track The Liquidator, which is, by the way, one of my favourite Van der Graaf songs of all time, and seems to sort of precipitate a different style for the band that at that time was taken no further. It's tuneful track, direct, almost catchy. But as I say, it was more of a twig than a branch. In fact, it wasn't released, this track, until 1982 on a compilation album that covers the interregnum between the first breakup of Van der Graaf Generator and their reformation in 1975. That album's called Time Vaults, as some may know. So, in retrospect, I think that we can see that a certain aesthetic had already been established in Van der Graaf circles, which would then be continued on Nadir's Big Chance, right, which came out in 1974, just before Van der Graaf reformed for the first time, making their classic trilogy of mid-70s albums, which many people, I'm one of them, considered their best work. Right. Nadir's Big Chance, by the way, followed another 4, yes, count 'em, Peter Hammill solo albums following the first breakup of Van der Graaf. He had a sort of Beatles level of prolificness, our Peter. It still does. The album Nadir's Big Chance seems to be a loose concept album centering around this figure called Ricky Nadir, who, legend has it, is Peter Hamill's alter ego. This guy seems to be a sort of immigrant rock star in the UK, hence the proto-punk sound of the songs that concern him on the album, right? In other words, this punk sound is something like, it's weird, it's something like a quote, like a performance, a mimesis, if you will. That's not the first Greek word I'll be using today. Pay attention. For that. And in other words, Hamill's not exactly creating punk here, but he's like imagining something like it already exists, right? And he's copying it. But, and here's the twist, it doesn't really exist yet, right? What we in fact have is something like glam rock, certainly in the British context, which is thought of as a sort of throwback to early rock and roll. And this seems to be what Hamill's referencing here. He mentions it in one of the tracks directly. So yeah, we have one of these paradoxes that sometimes happens in art here, where you, in imitating something but wrong, you sort of create something new. Which I believe is what Aristotle called catachresis. So there you are. There's another Greek word for you. Turning to the album itself, I suppose from a certain angle, this could be considered one of Hamill's greatest albums. From another angle, it's not his greatest album at all. That would be the Prog angle, I suppose. But I think one reason for thinking it could be his greatest album ever is because it's just so full of like interestingly written and exciting tracks, redolent of the Liquidator aforementioned. One thinks of the title track. The Institute of Mental Health is Burning. What a title. Very apt. Open Your Eyes, which is great. What else? Been Along So Long. Great ballad. That's just the first half. In the second half, I really like, what else do we have here? Airport. I think it's great. People You Were Going To is lovely. And the closer, which is 2 or 3 Spectres, I think is a highlight. Which has an awesome riff in the middle in a typically impossible time signature. That wasn't it at all, but it sounds a bit like that. It's a very striking moment there. Now, it should be said that the album retains some elements of the Van der Graaf aesthetic, namely rousing band arrangements, including the famous doubling between Peter Hammill and David Jackson, which I think of as 2 different types of breath. Right? I've said in a previous episode that I think that David Jackson is Peter Hamill's real alter ego. He's like the spectre, the one that haunts Peter Hammill in the Van der Graaf context. That's an important element of the Van der Graaf sound, right? There's this sort of doubling between, the worded voice and the wordless voice, right? And the other thing I think that's reminiscent of Van der Graaf Generator on Nadir's Big Chance is like the programmatic care with which the album's constructed. So, what's new here? Well, the voice here is maximally aggressive. It also, relatedly, incorporates a weird, chaotic double tracking, which seems to be new. I suppose the point there is to maximize the paranoia, right? It's a very paranoid album, this. And there's a lot of distorted electric guitar, of course, as you would expect on a sort of proto-punk album. Not to mention the distortion he puts on his voice, which he does a lot anyway, but here it's absolutely constant, unceasing. And then we have these pulsing rhythmic arrangements, which is perhaps the most obviously proto-punk element. I always think it's weird with punk because punk seems to be returning to the American roots of rock and roll. But actually, the American roots of rock and roll, of course, are black music and jazz, which is very swingy. But punk music, especially in the British context, punk is sort of like a British invention, but it's a misincorporation of an American cultural theme. You can see how there's a pattern here in the nature of invention that's at stake in each case. But what I was going to say was there's almost no compound time in these, that's to say swing time in any of these punk bands. It's all very simple time, da, 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 which I think sounds almost more European, perhaps even Krautish, you could say. So that's a weird thing. Anyway, the harmonic constructions are also less ambitious, more conventional. There's lots of ballads on this album. That's more reminiscent of Hamill's other solo work. But even the ballads here, I think, are harmonically more straightforward and direct than the sort of twisty constructions that you find on the other 5 albums or whatever Peter Hammill did during this 2-year period. Should also make reference here to Roxy Music, I think. If you want a sort of like a quoted glam sound, but with saxes, and perhaps sort of, let's say, an art school phenomenology, if you like. Then you have to go to the Roxys, of course. And there's a family resemblance, I suppose, as Wittgenstein would call it, between the sound of this album and that of Roxy music. Right? I'll come back to this later on. The lyrics, what to say about the lyrics? You also have to say something about the lyrics on a Peter Hammill album. I think notable lyrics here are the title track, which is a throwdown, like punk often used to be a throwdown. It's anti-glam, actually, as I alluded to before, and vaguely political, which Van der Graaf Generator almost never were. Smash the system with a song, he sings in the refrain. And then you've got the Institute of Mental Health burning, right? Burning, which references, I think, Hamill's schizoanalysis position, as I've called it before, in my H to HE episode. Schizoanalysis is a term from Deleuze and Guattari, the French philosophers. And again, some politics. It says we can't call the fire brigade because none of them had been paid. So the Institute of Mental Health is burning. Aptly, I mean that's a funny line, isn't it? Anyway, and there's a lot of humour on this album. Much more present on this album than on any of his other albums, which are really glum. So I think, the sense of irony is probably a punkish element, I would say. Now, the rest of the album seems to be sort of just made up of vignettes from the life of this rock star, Nadir. Nadir is an important name, isn't it? Because it means like the low point, the 0 point of experience, basically. So that could be a reference to punk. But also a reference to Hamill's own, schizoanalysis, as I said earlier. One other track that I'd like to mention lyrically is, at the lyrical level, is People You Were Going To, which seems to be a reference to Mike and Susie, the characters that emerge in the track Refugees, which is an earlier Van der Graaf song, which was very hippie-ish about going to California. So I think it's sort of, the theme here seems to be goodbye to the hippies. Goodbye to the hippies, hello punk, perhaps we could say. There's also more anti-fascist and anti-capitalist references throughout the album. In the closing track, there's a bit, it's called Two or Three Spectres. Hamill's obsessed with spectres, with ghosts. He might be an example of an artist that uses the technique that the Jacques Derrida, the deconstructionist philosopher, calls hauntology. Let's say an ontology of haunting, right? Where your being is colonized by ghosts, as it were. This last track seems to be a polemic against the music industry, which I suppose is another political thing. The music industry, which seems to have forced Nadir to sell out, if I'm following the story correctly. It's not entirely clear. But yeah, it's got some great lines, this bit. Talking about the manager, he says, all the press receptions for his business friends who spill their Tattinger on the floor while the band sip English lager just outside the door. Great stuff. Funny again. I think it's funny anyway, even if you don't. So, in other words, Nadir seems to be vanquished in the end. He's reached his Nadir, if you like. And this apparently paves the way for a reformation of the proper band, which is Van der Graaf Generator, is it not? So this, I don't know, this underlines that this album could be seen as a lacuna in Hamill's career. I mean, why did Van der Graaf Generator reform? It's weird, isn't it? Like, in other words, why did Hammill ultimately go back to Prog after this album? I mean, it's not could be a number of answers to it. Not an empirical one. He was offered a tour or something. I think we need to look for a structural answer, basically. But anyway, this probably takes us to our second album of the day, namely "Are We Not Men" by Devo. Let's just abbreviate the title for a second. Although, actually, before we go there, I should probably mention, just before getting off the question of Nadir's big chance, there's a famous interview with John Lydon from the Sex Pistols, in which he basically says that he loves Hammill and everything he's done. But what's interesting is that when he has to choose a couple of tracks by Hammill to play on his, whatever it is, Tommy Vance curated BBC Desert Island Discs type show, he actually chooses 2 songs from Nadir's Big Chance. In other words, Hamill's influence is present in the very heart of the punk movement, right? Now, fast forward to summer 1978, and we have the counterexample to our Hammill album, right? The Counterweight. Again, Devo's debut. Q, Are We Not Men? ? We Are Devo! ! Now, this really is a punk classic, this album. Devo with the fluid in the punk bag, as the band denominated themselves. Yeah, I think this is a really great album. It's got that sense of excitement and freshness that you get from the best punk records. Sort of unabashed, childlike glee, you know. But it's also quite clearly, on this occasion, the product of a sort of like elite New York art school, I would say even like art gallery sensibility. It's pop art, really, like in the literal sense, pop as art. So this is what I mean when I say punk bands doing prog. All right, the general context for Devo is the punk paradigm. But on the other hand, we have examples here, quite clear examples, I think, of what our friend Paul Stumpy calls the progressive ideology, i.e. a certain experimentalism, you know, and an unashamed artsiness, if that's a word. Could be slightly parodic, this. Although it's great original music, but if it's parody, that might explain why. Well, if it seems like parody, even that might explain why the band received some ambivalence from the normal punk audience. It wasn't, overwhelmingly well received, this album, although in retrospect it's considered a punk classic, right? But yeah, I think authenticity is a big thing in punk, isn't it? Or it was. This week I happened to be reading A Hanging, the essay by George Orwell, where he oversees a hanging as one of his jobs as part of the British Imperial Police in Burma. And it's considered a classic of English literature, this text, and it's like it's a very graphic description of a hanging. The kind of meaninglessness of, I suppose the banality of evil, really. But the interesting thing about this text is that it's disputed whether Orwell ever actually observed a hanging. So to what extent can you trust the author? Anyway, I think that's an issue here, possibly, in the album's reception. But anyway, what else? Well, like a lot of punk, I think this music has a sort of slight Krautish aesthetic. And the references here are plentiful, actually. Devo, of course, are an American band, but they recorded this album in Cologne, in Germany, under the watchful eyes of Brian Eno and David Bowie, who were in their famous Berlin phase. Apparently, the band even spent the first day in the studio jamming with Holger Tsukai, how do you pronounce his name, from Cannes? And Dieter Moebius, remember the Moebius strip? Who was also an important krautrock denizen. So yeah, Krautish, but again, also references to early rock and roll, right? And that's where the sort of youthful energy comes from. I'm not completely sure how youthful a lot of these people were, but anyway, in reality. But anyway, I think what's interesting about the aesthetic here is that at this level, at the rock and roll level, is that Devo sort of twists the perversions of early rock and roll, again twisting, Moebius band, and they make them properly perverse here. Uncontrollable urge, the mongoloid, Jocko Homo, too much paranoias, gut feeling. What else? I saw my baby getting sloppy. Again, I think we have I think we can say we have a schizoid dimension here, which again takes us back to Peter Hammill. The sort of intelligence of the body without organs, again to quote Deleuze, right? Where normal structures are suspended and kind of stretched, right? Deleuze's book on Francis Bacon, The Painter, is quite interesting from that point of view. Anyway, I want to make a specific reference here to the music writing. As I said, it's a rock and roll sound, but each track on the album incorporates some sort of sonic or harmonic surprise, right? In other words, they take each track into a new dimension, which is what you want, isn't it? I mean, that's what you want, with good art, this twisting effect. You can almost actually move from Deleuze to Derrida again, the deconstructionist, because they're almost deconstructionist, their songs, I think, Devo. Perhaps you could say Devo constructionist. There you go. I like inventing neologisms in our podcast. So in the sense that they're deconstructing these songs. So you start with a normal song and then they just take it into a whole different dimension, right? Thereby questioning what it means for this thing that we've called a song to be a song, I was thinking that a good example of this is the track Space Junk, right? Which is a sort of pop song. And halfway through it just turns into like a list of geographical locations for no apparent reason. Accompanied by some enossification, I think it's called. Remember The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, Genesis fans. And then we also have a series of, absolutely classic tunes here. As I've said, Uncontrollable Urge. The enormously politically incorrect track Mongoloid. Jocko Homo, which is my favourite track on the album. This track, by the way, is in 7/8 time, which is not a punk thing because it shows that there's a sort of more sophisticated musical sensibility at work here. It's not sort of like relentless, amateurish 4/4 time signatures, rigid 4/4 time signatures that even an amateur could play. It's more sophisticated than that. So again, progressive ideology creeping in. Plus, the Eno parts are decisive here. Brian Eno's the producer, right? I think they should have let him do more, actually. And I think this was a point of contention between the band and producer. And by the end, they weren't even speaking to each other. But yeah, his contribution to Jocko Homo is amazing. And what else? Gut Feeling, Comeback Joni. You also can't neglect to mention their epic cover of Satisfaction by the Stones, which I think is a paradigm of how to cover a classic track. Because the original was unimprovable. So how do you cover it? Well, you have to completely reimagine it. So different rhythm, different tune, different mood, to the point where it's practically a joke. And there is a great sense of humour at work throughout this whole album. But as I say, it's not necessarily parodic. It's just absurdist, really. I think, actually, this might take us to the question of the singer, Mark Mothersbaugh. Is that how you pronounce his name? Who I think does an amazing job here. He might be known to younger listeners, if such a thing exists, for composing music to children's films and series, and even video games. He seems to be a complete one-off, this guy, and he's sort of frenetic, specifically punky, because again, childlike, crypto-autistic, perhaps schizoid, you could say, style is probably the outstanding element of this album. If you want another artistic reference here, do you? Do you want another artistic reference? We could even say that perhaps he's influenced by the Dada movement, right? That's to say, Dada, pre-surrealism, post-First World War. When faced with an oppressive rationality, we have to go back to a sort of childlike primitivism. And he uses this a lot in his songs, so he does. Words used for pure sound, like da-da, yeah. That kind of effect. One other thing, finally, on this album, this brilliant album, Devo album, I think we should say that, like the Hammill album, this is really a concept album. I mean, it's literally a concept album in the sense that they have a rationale for it. I can't quite remember what it is, but it's something like something to do with them being the product of what they call de-evolution of the human race, right? Hence the title, Devo, right? That's to say they're sort of adopting a band persona for the album. I think it's a persona that changed really with each album that they did. So this album is written, sung, played, and produced by a character, and then on each subsequent album they had a different character, possibly with diminishing returns, but that's a matter of taste. So in conclusion, we have this Devo album is a high concept album, plenty of artistic references, deconstruction of classic pop songs, conceptualist words. In other words, a somewhat prog sensibility, but from a nominally punk band. Do you see? Now, what's the connection between these two albums? Have you guessed it yet? That's right, it's Brian Eno, right? Because we said that there was Brian Eno, by the way, who's from my hometown. My mum knows his brother. So we said that there was a Roxy music element in the Hammill album, right? And of course, Eno was the keyboardist and sort of ideological experimentalist in Roxy music. And as I mentioned earlier, Eno produced this Devo album. So yeah, there you have it. If you want to be led along the Moebius strip from prog to punk, Moebius band from prog to punk, our fellow traveller is definitely going to be not some ants. It's going to be Brian Eno. The ants is a reference to the Escher painting of the Moebius strip. I don't know what the implication of that is, but it is a fact. So maybe we can draw some conclusions from that at another time, because we won't be doing it today. So thanks very much for your attention. I hope that was in some way illuminating, as always. And I'll see you on the next edition of Crapper, which should be coming up next week or so. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.